Rabbi Wolpe, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you.
So obviously, I think this should go without saying. I'm honored to have you on the podcast. I appreciate you agreeing to do this. I finished this last night. It's a oldie but a goodie, right? That's what they call it. And yeah, so before we get into the book and what you do, can you please give maybe a brief introduction as to who you are and
Sure.
what you do on a day-to-day basis?
So I'm the rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. And most of what I do day to day is to counsel congregants, do bar mitzvahs, funerals, weddings, hospital visits. I mean, obviously not during the pandemic, but that's what I normally would do. And I'm starting to do again. But I also do a lot of writing and speaking in various fora and have over the years. And that's basically what I do.
Great. So in your book, that you have a lot of books, but in this one that I mentioned earlier, Why Faith Matters, you mentioned that your dad was a rabbi, and
Yes.
there was a point in your life when you were a teenager when you decided that maybe religion was not for me and you're going to go
Right.
the other way. How did you eventually come back to religion, and did you always feel like it was a calling?
So no, I didn't always feel like it was a calling. I'm not even sure that I would say it is a calling. I don't think, I mean, I found actually, it's an interesting thing. When I was in rabbinical school, we had an interfaith conference with Christian ministry students and Jewish rabbinical students. And when they asked if it was a calling, almost all the Christian ministry students said yes, and almost all the Jewish rabbinical students said no. The language of a calling didn't so much appeal to most of them, and I don't think it does exactly to me. But what happened basically to me was, as I got older, I started to doubt my doubts, and I began to rethink a lot of the questions that as a teenager I had sort of dismissed, because I had believed that people were religious because they were weak or uninformed. Not my father. I curiously always made an exception for him because he obviously was neither of those things. He was a wonderful man. But I sort of partly got that image from reading Bertrand Russell, of whom I was a big fan for many years. And so, but when I started, as I got older, to meet people who were seriously involved in religious life, I began to think differently about it. And so I started to explore it. And the deeper I got, the more I realized that I wanted, and this may be the substitute for a calling, I wanted to use my life to learn and teach the tradition and to be an advocate for the Jewish people.
Mm. And growing up, what would you say one of the most important lessons your dad taught you growing up?
Oh, I could give you a long list, but I'll tell you one that sticks in my mind because he wrote us. I have three brothers, and I remember during one summer, he wrote us a letter, and I don't remember the rest of it, but I remember part of it where he said, in his life, what distinguished people who were successful from people who were not, basically. I think the way he put it, remember this was a much earlier age, was what separated the men from the boys. I'm not sure that's the language that people would use today, but that was the language that he used, was stamina. He said it wasn't talent and it wasn't training. It was going back and doing it again and again and again and again. And when you fail, you do it again. And I think that has proved to be true in my life, and I think in the lives of people that I know. If you're put off or discouraged from failure, then you failed twice. So I thought that was a very valuable lesson.
Mm. Wow. And I'm not aware. Was your dad alive when you became a rabbi?
Oh yeah, he saw me become a rabbi. He He lived long enough to see a number of my books, and to attend a lot of lectures that I gave and so on and so forth. I was very blessed that way.
Did you guys have any major differences, or were you pretty similar?
I don't know that we had differences, certainly. I don't know that we had major differences. I think probably we look at the world fairly similarly. But generationally, there were differences. Certainly, I think that he was, for his time, very liberal. He religiously, I'm talking about. He hired the first female rabbi that was ordained by the conservative movement, which at the time was very controversial. But I think that probably I probably am used to and would accept all sorts of things that he wasn't used to, because it was a different time and a different age.
Mm. Well, that point about the female rabbi actually leads me to one of my questions, and that's why is it so controversial? This is purely out of curiosity, but why is it so controversial to have female rabbis? Is it the education they receive? Why does one sect of Judaism, per se, maybe see that as frowned upon, and then another as more?
Well, there are a bunch of reasons why traditional Jews don't have female. One is because there never were, and the hold of precedent is very strong. Women stayed at home and raised children, and men studied Torah and became public figures, and that was true for thousands of years. And it was true in almost every society, but it was certainly true in Jewish society. So that's one. And then there are some religious obligations that women are not enjoined by in Jewish law, and men are. And so that also has something to do with participation in religious services and so on. Because remember, before, basically, I have a brother who's a sociologist. He's professor of sociology at Emory and head of the ethics center there. And I remember he said to me once that the single biggest social change agent in the last, I don't know how many hundreds of years, was the pill. Because once women could control their reproductive systems, and they didn't end up having child after child after child, it liberated them to the world. But before that, most women were not liberated to the world. They had multiple children. Also, a lot of children died in childbirth. And so there was no opportunity to do the kinds of things that women do regularly now. I mean, there's a lot about the modern world that is much, much better than the world in medieval or ancient times. I used to teach ancient medieval Western Civ in an undergraduate school. And I used to tell my students all the time, if somebody ever comes to you with a time machine and says to you, what century would you like to go to? Say, this one, please. So the past is, romantically, it's wonderful, but in terms of life, not so much.
Yeah, that's very true. But do you see, is it more common to have female rabbis now? Is it commonplace in Judaism, or is it still...
It is outside of Orthodoxy. Outside of Orthodoxy, it's absolutely common. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And they receive, this is again curiosity, because
sure.
I just don't know. But
yeah.
Do they receive the same education that a man would? And
identical. So they go to the same schools, study in the same classes, whether it's rabbinical school or doctorates or whatever, just like in medicine or any other field.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you just mentioned that aside from the Orthodox, this is commonplace. In Judaism, obviously, there are three major denominations, right? So it's the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Right. Can you explain what the biggest differences are?
The biggest difference between the three, there's also Reconstructionism, but that's a smaller group. The biggest difference is Reform Judaism is essentially built on the autonomy of the individual and individual choice, and doesn't restrict anybody's freedom. And so Also, it tends to be politically very liberal. That's not 100%, but that's sort of built into the DNA of a lot of the reform movement. It was the first to have female rabbis, the first to have same-sex marriage, and so on. The conservative movement has that, but followed later. The conservative movement tries to balance traditionalism and ritual and so on with modernity. I'm a conservative rabbi. And then orthodoxy, which still also is deeply affected by modernity, though in different ways, tries as hard as it can to adhere to classical Jewish law.
Mm-hmm. And again, you just mentioned the fact that you're a conservative rabbi. How do you work to balance the maybe you're not quite reform and you're not quite orthodox?
So a lot. For example, I don't spend money on Shabbat. I don't go to movies on Shabbat. I don't drive. I don't those sorts of things. But I will eat I'm a vegetarian anyway, but I'll eat vegetarian food in a regular restaurant, which an Orthodox person would not do. Fairly strict Orthodox people would not do. And so that's an example of a balance. And I think the question of female rabbis is a good example. The female rabbis in the conservative movement are obligated to the same things that male rabbis are, but they're female rabbis, so that would not be accepted by Orthodoxy. And the obligations would not be accepted by the Reform.
Mm-hmm. And is your congregation receptive to these changes or these?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. A conservative congregation tends to be composed of people of a very broad range. Some are very traditional and some are pretty liberal. So I don't think any of them have a problem with a female rabbi. That's been established now in conservative Judaism for a long time. Some in my congregation, in part because my congregation has a peculiar demographic that's not true to all conservative congregations, but some in my congregation are still uncomfortable with same-sex marriage, but I'm not.
And on a day-to-day basis, what's the life of a rabbi? What do you do? And is there such a thing as a day-to-day routine?
Well, there isn't exactly. I mean, every morning when you wake up, you could have, someone could be sick, someone could have an emergency, someone could have had something happen to them that they need to talk to you about. You never know. But there's a lot of meetings with people for all sorts of life questions. There's some of them personal, some of them professional. There's counseling with individuals and with couples. There's wedding meetings, there's bat mitzvah meetings, sometimes lunches with congregants, board meetings in the evening, events, community events, not again during the pandemic, but I used to very often go to community dinners for different Jewish organizations and causes. And then there's studying and writing, which is a big part of a rabbi's day, and also morning prayer, and Friday night and Saturday, Shabbat, there are prayer services. You write sermons, articles, as you point out, I've written some books. So all of that, and any given day has a somewhat different mix of all of those things.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned the fact that you write and you research and study and write books. Did you always feel like you had an obligation to write books, or did you have a
that
personal
started
connection?
That actually started before I became a rabbi. I always wanted to write. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was a little kid. So that was never a question to me. The question was, what was I going to write about? And when I went to rabbinical school, I basically got my subject. So I always wanted to be a writer. I always enjoyed writing. I enjoyed having written. I don't know that I always enjoy the writing, but I enjoyed having written. And even in high school, I was the kind of kid who, my English papers were always good, even if I didn't pay attention in math class. So. And I was an English literature major in college. And I never thought about majoring in anything else. It was obvious that I was going to major in English literature. And had I not been a rabbi, I would say odds are pretty good that I would have been an English professor.
Not a journalist?
No.
Not
Nope.
interested?
I'm very interested in politics, but I'm more interested in literature than in politics, ultimately. I'm more interested, and that's because I'm more interested in the deep human condition than I am in the particular social condition. I know that those can't be separated so easily, but what I mean is, if you say to me, like, what's the nature of human beings? That's a much more interesting question than why did this candidate win? And even when you ask when I read the Torah, I read it with a psychological lens. I'm more interested in the psychology than the politics. So it never attracted me so much to be a journalist, but it always attracted me to read great books and to write about them and think about them.
Do you remember a particular book that really got you going when you were younger? That you said, this is what I want to do?
I remember several. I mean, when I was younger, I was a sports fanatic. So I used to read a lot of sports books and they got me going. But there are a few books that I would say for me are the most, I have three favorite novels, and I have probably one nonfiction book that meant the most to me, but they were a little bit later. The nonfiction book was called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which is an exploration of how human beings deal with the fear and inevitability of death. The novel that probably I would say I've reread most often is George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, because her description of the human condition and the genius of that novel never ceases to move me.
Mm-hmm. Again, purely out of curiosity, is it common for rabbis to read outside of the religious domain?
Yeah, I think most rabbis tend to be intellectually curious, and since they spend their lives around books, a lot of rabbis are pretty. I mean, I probably do it more than most because that's my orientation. But most rabbis I know spend a lot of time reading other kinds of stuff too, whether it be newspapers, magazines, or books. I mean, now newspapers and magazines now obviously are largely online, but I still get a newspaper in the morning because I'm a dinosaur.
Okay, so I really want to get into the crux of your work and what you do for a living and why faith matters. I think that's an important question. I personally, I'm going to establish this. I am agnostic. I went from maybe a radical atheist type when I started college to, well, let me tell you how I came to your work. So I used to watch debates on YouTube all the time, and I saw a debate that obviously you were there with Christopher Hitchens. And there was a point where I used to think that Christopher Hitchens won this debate. And that was when I started college. By the time I finished college, 4 years later, I started to think you won the debate because the points you seem to make were better than Christopher Hitchens. And the crux of the argument you're making. So the question is, why do we need religion?
So I think that I would give you a couple of answers to that. One of the answers I would give is that religion gives us the great universal principle of human beings. I mean, I don't know why I should care about somebody else just because they're human and I'm human. So what? If it's in my self-interest to screw them over, there's no reason not to. And if you say, well, that's because that would make you a bad person. First of all, I don't know where the standard of bad comes from if they're only human beings. I'm a human being and I think it makes me okay. And second of all, I don't care. You can think of me as a bad person as long as I come out on top. Religion throws a monkey wrench into that sort of reasoning, both by saying that all human beings are children of the same parent. And so we owe our obligations to one another because we are spiritual kin. And second, because there really is a standard of good and bad that exists in the world. Now, we don't always have easy access to it, but it does exist. So that's one reason. Another reason is that I think that it's really hard to organize people for good without some kind of transcendent or religious motivation. And that's one of the reasons why religious charities tend to be bigger charities, do more, care more. I mean, I remember once, I don't remember if this is in Why Faith Matters or not, but I had a friend who was building an orphanage in Haiti and asked me would I go down there and help. So I went down and helped. And at one point I went into the supermarket. And the supermarket was, like when I say a supermarket, but it had fewer shelves than you see behind me, and they had fewer products than there are books behind me. And there was a guy sitting there who looked like a Mennonite. He had a beard like this. And sure enough, he was a Christian. I don't remember what sect. And I said to him, what are you doing down here? And he said, I came down here to help build houses outside of Port-au-Prince because everybody's helping in Port-au-Prince, which is the big city. But outside, a lot of people need houses. So I came down to go, that's wonderful. I said, how long have you been here? He said, 15 years. I said, you've been here for 15 years? He goes, yeah. I said, well, what brought you down here for 15 years? He goes, my son. How long has your son been here? 25 years. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, because Jesus wants me to. Now, that motivation, because Jesus wants me to, or because in the Jewish tradition, I wouldn't say Jesus, obviously, but God wants me to, that's really hard to reproduce. I'm doing it because it's a good thing to do. So the motivation to goodness is really powerful in religion. Does it always work? Obviously not. Like any organizing principle, can it be used for bad? Obviously, yes. But I think on the whole, it does a great deal of good in this world. I was doing a debate. This one was not with Hitchens, although I did a bunch of them with him, and he was a fascinating character. But I did a debate called the Intelligence Squared debate in New York. And I asked them how many of them had ever heard of Doctors Without Borders. And of course, everybody raises their hand. And I said, how many of them had ever heard of World Vision? Nobody raised their hand. And I said, World Vision is the largest charity in the United States by far. Infinitely bigger than Doctors Without Borders. And they do work all over the world, but they're an evangelical charity, so you've never heard of them. And a lot of the good that religion does is not known about or credited, but it does.
Right. I remember reading this study a couple of years ago. Arthur Brooks conducted a study where religious communities gave more to charity than non-religious communities, and by a significant amount, I should say.
And they even give to charities that are not religious by
Correct.
a significant amount. Yeah.
Right.
And look, I see this even in my own community. I mean, my community, like every community, it has lots of problems. And it is not heaven on earth in my synagogue. But boy, when people are in trouble, or when people, lose someone, or they're remarkable. And they're not just remarkable for a day or for a week. I mean, it's a sustaining effort of taking care of one another, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it is. But can I ask a question? Does intention matter? I think it's like some people do it at the kindness of their hearts,
Right.
and because of their, their friend or community member is suffering and they want to help.
Right.
But some people, is it common? I don't know if anybody will admit it, that they're just trying to get some kind of brownie points or.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I have thought about it and written about that. And here's what I would say to it. Intention matters in terms of the like how you would grade the deed. Is it good or bad, or how good is it? And to do it because you believe it's the right thing to do or God wants you to is better than to do it because God will give you points for it. No question. Having said that, if you're the person in need, you'd rather the deed be done, even if the motivation isn't the highest motivation. So there is that too, which is, I would not want the only good deeds in this world to be deeds that were done out of pure goodness, because that would immensely reduce the number of good deeds in the world.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We talked briefly. Again, that's how I was introduced to you. You debated Christopher Hitchens,
Yeah.
and I've always wanted to ask.
Yeah.
I actually read. I think it's from whenever he passed away. I forgot the year he passed away, but you wrote an article or kind of an
I
obituary.
read an obituary. Right. I actually wrote 3 of them, believe it
Yeah.
or not.
I read one in Slate, I think.
Right.
That's what, yeah.
So there's one in Slate, there's one in the Jewish Journal, and there was one, I may have been in the Washington Post, I don't remember. But what I would say is Hitchens, I mean, look, I don't want to claim to have known him really well. We spent some time together. We had, I think, 6 debates. 4 or 5 of them are available on YouTube. And I obviously spent time with him outside of the debating thing, and in various settings. I think that first of all, it was very hard to win a debate with Hitchens for 2 reasons. 3 reasons actually. One was because he had this wonderful voice and tremendous sense of humor, and those 2 things together make it really hard, because he dismissed some arguments with a joke, and the joke was funny, but didn't really answer the argument. Like when we were arguing once about free will, and he said, "I believe in free will, I have no choice." And that was funny, but it actually didn't answer the argument. But the other reason was he had such a wide range of reference that he could pull stories and quotations apropos to whatever it is you were talking about, that were also generally very effective. And so it was a joy to sit and listen to him, even if what you were doing was debating with him. And there was a part of me that always felt with Hitchens, I don't know if this is true, and I will allow the listeners to decide for themselves, but there was a part of me that always felt with Hitchens that it was almost like he had these cannons, these bazookas, these intellectual heavy guns. And he decided one day, I'm going to train them on religion. And it was, I don't know how much of his indignation was genuine indignation, and it was just the joy of combat. And I always felt a little bit with him that it was that way. I didn't feel that way with Sam Harris. Sam Harris's arguments against religion feel to him, I think, like they're life and death. But I'm not sure that Hitchens really felt that way. He was indignant at a certain closed-minded religiousness and so on, but I'm not sure that religion per se was really what he hated in the world, as opposed to a certain mindset. But I could be wrong.
Yeah. Did you learn something in particular debating him?
The one thing I learned was not to quote Evelyn Waugh, but that was a particular debate. That was actually the only one I think that was not, or one of the 2 that were not taped, in which I said something about Evelyn Waugh. Doesn't matter the context particularly, and then he gave a long lecture about Evelyn Waugh and why, and he knew his entire life history. What I learned, I think most, what I think I learned most was that what actually a friend of mine said to me, maybe before my first debate with him, or my second debate with him, which was, when you debate someone like Hitchens, his manner is so large, his personality is so big, and his manner is so persuasive that there's a temptation to try to be like him. And I remember what this friend of mine said to me beforehand. He said, remember that you're debating as a rabbi, and if you cease to be a rabbi, you lose. Which meant that if I tried to be cutting or wittingly cutting the way he was, I lost the debate, because I was just going to be a cut rate Hitchens. I was going to imitate him, but not be him. And so I think that paradoxically, as powerful a person as he was, I learned from him to sort of stay in my own lane. And I would succeed or fail based on being a rabbi, not based on being a cut rate Hitchens.
Mhm. Did he ever, was there any indication that he would give in to some of the arguments you had?
I once, before one of the debates, I don't know exactly how to interpret this, so I will let, again, I will let your listeners interpret it. Before one of the debates, we were walking up the steps, and apropos of nothing, absolutely nothing, came out of left field. He looked at me and he said, "You know that I will never say anything positive about you in public." So I think that that was his way of saying, even if I do agree with something that you say, or even if I do think that you have, I won't, because out there I'm a combatant. So don't ever expect. And I also think it was his way of saying, don't take this entirely personally. You know, if I say something cutting about you, it's the combat. So no, I never got an indication that he felt differently. And the last debate, which if somebody asks me, "Oh, I want to see one of your debates with Hitchens," this is the one that I think is the most interesting in some ways, because it was the least debatey debate. And that's the last one that I did. He and Sam Harris were on one side, and I was with Rabbi Brad Artson on the other. And the debate was about whether there's an afterlife. And the reason that it was so interesting was he was already quite sick. And the chances that he was going to live were not great. And so I think it's interesting, and I'll let you, again, your listeners who can look it up and find it, decide whether he left any door open that they would not think he otherwise would.
Mhm. Yeah, those debates. Um, this is a large statement, but they really did change my life in a lot of ways, because, and which leads me again to my next question, because I mean, it changed my life, but I don't know if it changed a lot of people's lives. And
Right.
I asked this question before: do you believe that debating the existence of God with radical
Right.
atheists has any utility?
That's a really good question. And I've thought about it because one of the things that I realized, and I think if you look at the comments on the YouTube page, it's easy to see that the vast majority of people who watch these debates are people who don't believe, and that the believers feel like they don't need to watch a debate, and the non-believers want to see the religious guy taken down. And so you see comment after comment after comment cheering on the debaters against religion, and that's true whoever they debate against. And so I don't know. My idea in going into it was I wanted people who thought that religion didn't have a decent intellectual defense to at least come out saying, okay, so I don't agree, but he made a coherent case, and it wasn't, because God said so. I don't know, honestly, how many people heard that message. I'm not sure. It also was a certain cultural moment when I was upset with the portrayal of religion that was coming from people like Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and all of them, as though religion was this. They talked about a religion that I never grew up with and I did not recognize. As being, closed-minded and a Luddite and frankly stupid and ignorant, and that wasn't my experience of religion. So that was another reason I wanted to do it.
Mhm. I think one of the things I realized, I read, it's a short book, Hitchens's last book called
Yeah,
Mortality, and I think he left the door open because there seems to be a moment where towards the end of the book, because he's writing because time is running out for him, and he
yes,
knows that.
yeah,
Um, and it's always that famous expression, there are no atheists in the foxhole. But
right.
my question is, it's not really a question, it's we might never know, was he an atheist to the very end? And
I don't
it
know.
seemed to me, it's just
Yeah,
personally, I suspect he wasn't. I'm not sure if he believed, I don't know what he believed in. Like
right.
that's
I
the
would
weird thing
say
about
it's
Hitchens.
very hard. It's very hard to face death and not think, at least, gee, I hope, you know, maybe I don't expect, but I hope.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that book, it is an interesting book. And it's written in his characteristic style, which makes it a pleasure to read. But he does say there that the hard thing is not that he's leaving the party, but that he's leaving the party while the party's still going to go on. And that's true, certainly. And it has got to be very. Also, by the way, I don't know if you've read his autobiography, Hitch 22.
Mm-hmm.
I either read it very late in knowing him, or maybe I read it after he died. I don't remember. But if you read his autobiography, which I really commend to people, again, it's a fascinating read. His mother ran away with a priest, and they died in a suicide pact. So if you say, gee, think his hatred of religion could have any psychological roots, certainly could, and he would have good reason for it. He also, by the way, discovered in adulthood that he was Jewish. He didn't know that growing up. He discovered it, I remember it like in his 30s, that his mother was actually Jewish. And so there's a lot there that helped shape him that I think we don't know. And so I wouldn't want to speak to what his psychology was at the end. Who knows?
Yeah. Something you alluded to before is it's really hard to face death.
Yeah.
When you're young, like myself, it's you don't really think about it, but
Right.
as people get older, they start to think about it more often. One of you open your book, Why Faith Matters, talking about a friend that's dying of cancer, and he's not a religious person, and he needs some sort of advice as to how to deal with the situation. And you actually gave a really good piece of advice, and you said that this is your opportunity to teach one final lesson to your kids.
Right.
How does one get ready for death, or how does one think about death?
I think that it has a lot to do. I mean, it varies very much with individual psychology.
Mhm.
I've seen people, they say if you live a good life, then you're ready to die, but that has not been my experience. My experience has been some people who've lived a good life are ready to die, and some people who've lived a lousy life are ready to die, and some people who've lived a good life are not ready to die at all, and some people who've lived a lousy life are not ready. I think it goes deeper than how good your life has been. Although that obviously has something to do with it. If you don't feel cheated, I suppose it's easier to feel like you can leave the party. But the only way that I know of to get ready for death is, first of all, to recognize that this is the universal end of all human beings who have ever lived, and that even though you feel a sense of unfair exceptionalism, why should I die? The truth is, you should die for the same reason that everybody dies, which is that's how life works. And some people die sooner and some people die later, and some people die easier and some people die harder. And the question that is left is not whether you'll die, but what legacy will you leave? And so I think as you face death, which I've now had to do a couple of times with various illnesses that I didn't know if I would survive them or not, you just have to think about, like, have I done everything that I could do for the people that I care about before I die? And so, because the truth is, all of us, sooner or later, are going to get forgotten in this world. But the people that you care about, they're the ones who are going to remember you. And so they're the ones to whom you owe whatever goodness you can bring them.
Mm-hmm. I was once I went to a book lecture by Atul Gawande, Dr. Atul Gawande, who wrote a book,
Sure.
a wonderful book called Being Mortal.
Mhm.
And he was talking about his inspiration, who was a man named Sherwin Newland, I believe that's his
Yes.
name. He wrote a
Yeah.
book. He wrote a book called
How we die.
How We Die,
Yeah.
right? And Atul Gawande mentioned an interesting point. He goes, "How We Die is, world renowned. People translated it into so many languages. People read it to this day." But he had another book called How We Live, and it didn't sell anything in comparison.
Huh. That's
So
interesting.
we have this curiosity about the unknown and what happens after we die. Is it just darkness? Is it something else? Do we go somewhere else? Or
Right.
and I don't really know, because again, I'm not an expert, but what is Judaism's position on the afterlife?
I would say the easiest way to explain it is Judaism believes that the soul lives on, but doesn't take any dogmatic position about exactly what that means. Because the truth is that none of us, when you start to describe what happens after you die, you start to sound silly. I'll lie in green fields and listen to harp music, which, as Mark Twain says in his book Letters from Earth, he goes, you wouldn't want to do that for 5 minutes while you're alive. So why do you think that's going to keep you happy for the rest of eternity after you die? But having said that, the idea that if there is a God, whatever God is, that some of that is in human beings means that there's something about us that's eternal. And this is, I believe, the great division. The great division between people is not so much religious, non-religious, as it is materialist, non-materialist. That is, do you think people are more than stuff? Or do you basically think they're just a particular collection of chemicals? If you think they're just a particular collection of chemicals, then you assume that they're going to disappear. But if you think that the non-tangible is real, and there's something about us that is you can't point to, but it's something, then that something lives on.
Can you explain that belief a little?
I assume that human beings are not purely physical creatures. I like T.R. Desjardins, who was I think he was a Jesuit theologian, and paleontologist, by the way, among other things, said, we're not physical creatures having a spiritual experience, but spiritual creatures having a physical experience. And I like that way of thinking of people, that in fact, what is most important about us is not our DNA, is not our physical manifestation, but that there's some spark in us that is non-physical, that makes us uniquely who we are, and that is eternal. And somehow that lives on, although in what way, I have no idea, any more than I knew what this world was going to be like before I entered it. I mean, you can't possibly imagine a world where we're not that smart. You can't possibly imagine a world before you enter it. And so I feel the same way about whatever world is to come.
Mm-hmm. I've had people on this podcast that are Stoics, Epicureanists, one woman that preached almost writes about Aristotelian ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, there's been a great, almost philosophical revival of these ideas. And because people maybe don't believe in a religion, but they see this as a way to go through life.
Right.
How do those ideas and how do those philosophies differ from religion?
Well, it depends which ones, but I would say primarily the purpose of most of Epicureanism, Stoicism, so on, is to try to get you through life with a minimum of suffering. And so Stoicism preaches a lot about how you separate those things that touch you from those things that should not touch you. And it can be, I'm sure, a very useful life discipline. That's actually not religion's purpose. Religion's purpose is, how do you get through life with a maximum of goodness? And that means, by the way, sometimes you will invite suffering upon yourself. At least Judaism. I'm speaking now for Judaism. I don't want to speak for all religions. Buddhism has a different take on this, for example, but Judaism for the moment. I take on the sufferings of others, and that makes my life less frictionless. I'm supposed to fight the battles on behalf of other people. That makes my life less frictionless. It makes it harder, but it makes it better, I think. And I also think that all of us are the beneficiaries of people who took on fights that they didn't have to take on, and took on suffering that they didn't have to take on. And a world full of Stoics would be, I think, a less rich world for the generation that came after them. So I've never thought about it so much this way, but I'm thinking about it now, and maybe I'll write about it now that I'm thinking about it. I really think that the idea that you should minimize suffering is a less noble idea than the idea that you should maximize goodness. Although I understand that, you know, you would have a counter argument from people who don't believe as I do.
Yeah, and when reading books on those philosophies, and the same way as reading, studying religion, there's always one question that I think it's a very general question that I'm sure you get asked this all the time. What makes a good life? What constitutes a good life? I'm sorry.
I mean, apart from like the idea that I just mentioned about maximizing goodness, I would say the essence of I'm gonna go with Martin Buber here. Martin Buber was a Jewish theologian, profound Jewish theologian, and I wouldn't say that I'm on board with everything he said, but a lot of what he said has affected me very deeply. And his general approach is, his most famous book is called I, Thou, and it's about relationships between people. And his general sense is that the quality of your life is the quality of your relationship. It's not about what goes on inside you, but what goes on between you that really matters. So I would say that a successful life is, first of all, a life that is marked by strong and deep and loving relationships. It doesn't have to be 100 of them, it can be 2 of them. But that's one essential component. If you live, from a Jewish point of view, if you live your life alone in a cave, that's not a successful life. In that, by the way, Judaism and Christianity do differ. We don't have that monastic tradition. We don't have that tradition of, you know, separating yourself from society. And then I think you have to make the world better than when you came into it. That's also part of being a successful life. Do something, and you can make the world better than when you came. You don't have to be, you know, the president of the United States or head of a charity. You know, you can be any person. You can be a professor, a plumber, a tailor. It doesn't matter. If you help people and do good things. Let me give you a beautiful example. I just did a funeral for a woman in her 90s, and I was sitting with the other rabbi who I did the funeral with, and someone came in and said something to the rabbi and then left. And he said, "That man is a good man." I said, "You know, okay." I didn't know him. He said, "He's a dentist." And I once was in his office, and he's a very successful dentist. He's an oral surgeon, does very well. I was in his office, and there was a homeless man there in his chair. The guy clearly had his pack of thing, and he smelled good, and it was, and then he left. And I said, "Who is that guy?" He goes, "He lives, you know, on the street outside." He says, why were you?" And he said, "He's another human being. He was in pain. And he saw me coming in, and he said something. So I said, 'Come on in and I'll fix it.' And I did. And that, I mean, something like that to me is part of the definition of a successful life.
Yeah. That's I almost don't want to pivot to what I want to talk about next after that. But you mentioned earlier that you're interested in politics, and I think that's evident. Yeah. If you know, you go on your Twitter account, you see you talking about about politics. It's a little bit of a third rail at the moment, but can we touch a little bit on the Israel-Palestine debate?
Sure, absolutely. That's the one political issue that I'm very happy to talk about.
Yeah. you wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times recently. I apologize if I get the name of the article wrong, but it's something along the lines of, it's a long history and
Right.
it's more complicated than you think.
Right. That's okay, because I didn't give it the title. They gave it the title.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Can you, what is your position on the Israel-Palestine debate?
So here's my position. My position is there are, I think 26 Muslim states and 18 Christian states in the world. There are over 2 billion Christians and almost 2 billion Muslims and more than 1 billion Hindus. There are 15 million Jews and 1 Jewish state. The fact that it is the subject of unremitting hostility from the world is no coincidence, I think. And so I am a strong and staunch and unflinching and unapologetic supporter of Israel. They were born in a region where they have hostility all around them. I can only imagine what the United States would do if it was surrounded by enemies. I know what it would do. We know what it did when, after 9/11, it went and destroyed a country, really destroyed a country halfway across the world. Having said that, I also feel tremendous amount of empathy for the plight of the Palestinians, who really do suffer and who ideally would be living side by side with Israel in a Palestinian state. I think that is the solution that would be, were it possible, the ideal solution. It will not be possible until, and this has never happened, until the Palestinians, not individual Palestinians, not groups of Palestinians, but the Palestinian people and their leadership accept the continued existence of Israel and don't wish that they could actually wipe it off the face of the map. And if they ever had the power, would do so. But Hamas, for example, in Gaza, says in its charter that that's what it wishes to do. So I think it's a very, very difficult situation, but that's in a nutshell how I feel about it.
One of the main reasons I asked the question is not because it's very prevalent at the moment. I have relatives in Israel, and obviously that factors into it. I try to approach this with clear eyes, and
it's hard to do.
It's right. Very hard to do. But one of the things that I've always noticed about this one particular issue is the amount of vitriol that exists online, especially yes. On social media. Everyone jumps to their camps immediately. There's the pro-Palestine people right away, and then there are pro-Israel, and there's no nuance.
Yes.
Can we begin to resolve this in any way? Because it just seems to me that people in the United States are very quick to criticize Israel, but not as quick to criticize other countries in the region. I'm not going to tell people why that is, but I have my suspicions. But why is it that this one country gets targeted more than any other?
I don't think there's any question that anti-Semitism is part of it. I think it would be foolish to deny that when you hear people say specifically, explicitly anti-Semitic things about Israelis and Jews. So, I mean, for example, when the diversity head of Google says, if I were a Jew, I'd be worried about my appetite for killing people, and yet does not say, for example, about the Uyghurs, if I were Chinese, I'd be worried about my appetite for killing people. Or about the people in Myanmar. If I was in Myanmar, I'd be worried about my appetite for killing people. You ask yourself, why specifically the Jews? And I think that the answer is that anti-Semitic tropes have moved through society and exist now for thousands of years and have infected a lot of people who think that they are immune. And so Israel is a kind of magnet for this hatred. Now, there are other reasons, without doubt. Israel's an ally of the United States. We give Israel a lot of money. Israel aligns as a Western democracy, but as I was writing about today, there's only one country in which same-sex marriage, in the Middle East, in which same-sex marriage is recognized. That's Israel. There's only one country that has gay pride parades. That's Israel. And yet that's not something that you hear heralded by the left, but you go try to do that in Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Palestine, for that matter. There are semi-secret refuges in Israel where gay Palestinians go because they can't live in Palestine, not openly. And yet the hostility to Israel, as you point out, is way out of bounds with any conceived of crimes.
Yeah. And again, it just seems to me that there is never any nuance with this debate. Ayan Hirsi Ali wrote a really good piece recently where she said that all these social media personalities and these famous people go out and they yell these slogans, not really knowing what they're talking about.
I think it's true.
And they're
Most
not,
people don't know.
maybe they're not pernicious in nature, but they're just, that's what they're saying. To begin to wrap up in the interest of time, obviously,
Yes,
the two last questions I ask of every guest are, I'll package them together and you can answer in whatever order you please. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? And the second one is, what are 5 books, any topic, fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to anyone?
Okay, what gives me hope for the future, first of all, is well, actually, I'll do it in reverse because maybe that's a nice closing statement. 5 books that I would recommend. So for those, I mean, it depends on your level of reading seriousness. So I'll give you different levels. Denial of Death. I can't imagine anybody who would read that book without profit. It's deep, it's beautiful, it's remarkably insightful. And I think that it won the Pulitzer Prize, I think, in the 70s, but it remains a book that people should read. Another book that I think every human being should read, I know that that's a large statement, but I really believe this, is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Again, a short book. I only will recommend short books. That's why I'm not going to say Middlemarch, a long book. It's magnificent, but it's a long novel. But Man's Search for Meaning is certainly one of them. I will stick for a little bit with my own tradition and say, if you would like to read a beautiful book of Jewish theology, you should read Heschel's The Sabbath. It's maybe 70 pages, not longer than that with big print. And it's not only about the Sabbath, it's about the modern condition, and is deeply insightful and beautiful. Then I will give you 2 semi-fiction, nonfiction books. I'm tempted to say, although I've already given a book, Man's Search for Meaning, that deals with the Holocaust, it's hard not to say Wiesel's Night. Again, a very short book of immense power and depth and importance. And let's see, as a fiction book, there's so many books of literature that I would love to recommend, but
You mentioned Middlemarch earlier in the.
I did, but as I said, it's a long book, so I don't know. I'll tell you what. Here's a book that I love. Trollope, the English novelist Trollope, and the first book in the Barsetshire Chronicles is the short one. It's called The Warden, and it, like The Hobbit, even if you don't read the whole Lord of the Rings, you can still love The Hobbit. Even if you don't read the whole Barsetshire Chronicles, you can still love The Warden. So I'll recommend that.
Great. And
hope for the future. What gives me hope for the future is, first of all, I really do believe in the resilience and ingenuity and genius of human beings. And we can do astonishing things, as the vaccine has proved, when faced with tremendous challenges. And I believe that even when it comes to climate change, I don't want to be Pollyannish about the reality of the challenges that we may face, but I have a great deal of faith in the genius of humanity if we are wise enough not to war ourselves away from this earth, which I hope we will be. And also, I have faith because I really do believe that there is something of eternity in us. So I hope and trust that we will never quite disappear.
Yeah. Rabbi Wolpe, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Absolutely. Take care.